Come back from where?
Came back from Baltimore. And I'm sure some people are in the cottage for Shabbos. Bergenfield. Oh, very nice. I thought you were at the cottage. No.
My daughter made a bar mitzvah.
Mazel tov. Very nice.
It wasn't in the bulletin, was it? No. Why not? I don't know.
Okay, what is it? Parshas Bechukosai. Page 708. 708, thank you for the phone. Good morning, everyone. I'm curious. Now, what throughout the years you've heard sheets, everyone? We have sheets for everyone? If you don't have, is there a pile somewhere?
There's a pile right in front of you.
Oh, thank you. Pesos in charge.
Oh, yeah?
Yep, now you are. Throughout the years we've heard and we've studied insights from commentators who look at the text of the Torah and they see it as some kind of template for the future as well. And they will go ahead and look at an historical period of post-Torah biblical period and say that that specific period perhaps refers to that specific statement in Bereshit. So you will have, for example, the sale of Yosef, and they will say, well, that perhaps refers to the Second Temple period, when the nation of Israel were simply not getting along as they should. They would sell their brothers. And it is common to do so. In general, these approaches come to an end with the destruction of the second Bet HaMikdash, because as Jews are being exiled from Spain or from France or from Germany to a different country in Europe, you're not going to exactly find biblical references. You're not going to have the ability to do so. Obviously, with the 20th century and with the return, where you have a situation now that the largest Jewish community in the world is in Israel, so you have again those who try to read into the text, which becomes a little bit more challenging or perhaps even dangerous. Now, what we're going to do today is we're going to work with this system, the system of reading text in the Torah. It is text where we could be quite comfortable seeing it as a prediction, because the Torah itself warns that if you do A, B, C, things will be good. If you don't perform them, there's going to be a reaction. You're going to be exiled from the land of Israel. So therefore, it is logical for commentators to take these descriptions of the sins and the descriptions of the exile and apply them to the actual events as they are described. Now, when we talk about sins and exile, we are going to refer to the First Temple period, and we're going to analyze those flaws that existed then that brought about the destruction, and thus the exile that is going to be described afterwards is going to relate to the events of the destruction. And following what Ramban tells us, Ramban notes that you should know, Parshas Bechukosai starts off with a promise for the good. You follow Torah mitzvot, you are a justice nation, right? You are sensitive for the welfare of those who are in need. Your religion is not a pagan religion, and you're not making Judaism into a pagan religion, but rather you focus on the essence of Judaism, things will be good. But if not, oh boy, things are going to go wrong. So Nachmanides takes those things that the Torah warns are going to occur, like I'm going to destroy your structures, and therefore those pagan gods that you put on your roofs, like in Israel today, they have the Dudei Shemesh. So in those days, they had these pagan images that they would put on their rooftops for protection. So God warns, if you do that, your houses will be destroyed. And as a result, those idols that you have on your rooftop, they're going to be destroyed as well. So obviously this portion is describing a nation that is tempted by avodah zarah, by idolatry. And they are told that they are going to be exiled. And they are told that, by the way, when you are exiled, the land will be able to rest, the rest that it was not able to do while you were in the land of Israel and ignoring the laws of the Shemitah, of the sabbatical. And then Ramban goes ahead and analyzes the text that is described in the book of Yirmiyah, for example, where we are told that this is a pagan nation, where we are told that this is a nation that ignores Shemitah, and then, as the Torah warns, you are exiled to a land and the land could rest. So this is what Ramban does in this week's portion. He tells us that this is a portion that refers to the flaws, to the corruption of the First Temple period, and it refers to the Galut Bavel, and actually he notes that even the return, when the Torah tells us in this portion that they will return, it makes reference to the incomplete return that occurs in the days of Ezra. On the other hand, he notes that if you look in the book of Devarim, where in Parashat Kitavo we have a description of another exile, that refers to the exile that occurs after the destruction of the second Bet HaMikdash. This is what Ramban does. And we're going to work with that system. And therefore, we're going to move, unfortunately, straight into the Tochachas, straight into the series of punishments. And they are detailed, not as brutal as the ones that appear in the book of Devarim. But let's turn to verse 33. It's on page 714. Page 714. And we are told here that you should know, when you are away, when you are going to be in exile, ve'etchem, and you, the people of Israel, ezarev goim, I will scatter you. I will scatter you among the nations. This is God talking. Now we usually, when we study the destruction of the first temple, we talk about the Jews being exiled to Babylonia. The words here seem to indicate that they are not going to all be in one place, but just as when you walk through your field with the seeds, you scatter them, it seems to indicate here that the nation of Israel will be scattered. Are they scattered among the nations? So if you look on the sheet here, we quote here the early 16th century authority, the Sforno, and he knows that yes, they were scattered, because the majority might have landed up in Babylonia, but there were Jews in other places as well. For example, in the book of Kings we are told that after the destruction, there were those who went to Mitzrayim. There were Jews in Mitzrayim. And if you interview Yemenite Jews, they will tell you that they have a tradition that their ancestors were not around for the Second Temple period. They stayed in touch with the rabbis, and therefore they were part of rabbinic Judaism, but they never came back. There were Jews that were scattered. So therefore the commentator makes it clear, yes, indeed, they were scattered among the nations. Now, the verse continues, V'harikoti acharechem charev. However, I will, unleash the sword after you. What does that mean exactly? Leharik acharechem, meaning the sword will chase you. So look again what the Sforno tells us here, that the sword is going to chase us. So he quotes a verse from the book of Yirmiyah, where it says, Hacherev asher atem yire'im mimena, that sword which you fear, tasigetchem be'eretz Mitzrayim, it will chase you in Egypt. So we're getting here some pieces of information that we have to put together. Number one, that there are Jews who do not go to Babylonia. There are Jews who for some reason land up in Egypt of all places. And number two, they are warned for whatever reason that the same sword that destroyed them in the land of Israel the same destruction that was brought about by the armies of Nebuchadnezzar is going to go after them in Egypt. The verse continues. Now this part I don't have on the sheet, but you can look at the Chumash itself. Vayta artsechem shemama, and your land will be desolate. Now this obviously is not referring to the destruction of the second temple, because there have been Jews in the land of Israel from the destruction of the second temple and on. In other words, we do have that historical gap which we mentioned during the Babylonian exile for those 70 years. In between the destruction of the first and the building of the second temple, there were 52 years where the land was desolate, but never after that. When Ezra returns and Ezra sanctifies the land, the sanctification and the sanctity of the land remains. But here we are told, and obviously, as Ramban points out, this refers to the period prior to the second temple, that there's going to be desolation in the land of Israel. But let's try to figure out what's happening here in Egypt. Why are there Jews? Why do Jews land up in Egypt? And why are they told that the sword of Nebuchadnezzar is going to go after them in Egypt? So let's turn to our sheets. And we'll first start off with the short quote from the book of Kings. Vayakumu kol ha'am, we are told that the nation arises, mikatan vad gadol, from young to old, from small to large, and the sarei, these army generals, and they make their way to Mitzrayim, ki yaru mipnei Kazdim. They were afraid of the Kazdim, the Babylonians. This is a nation that worked with the Babylonians. The two terms interchange. So this is what we are told. Jews make their way to Egypt. Now, by the way, there's a problem there. There's a problem of going to Egypt. Halachically speaking, a Jew should not move to Egypt. For business, it's okay, right? But to go ahead and make your Egypt your permanent home is problematic. So the big question is, why did Rambam live there and so many other people over the centuries? So that's a strong question. But Egypt is always viewed as a problematic country. And throughout biblical times, Egypt was the superpower, or one of the superpowers in the region. And Jews felt this security when they have this alliance with Egypt. Oh, we're good with Egypt. We don't need God. We could be okay. The Egyptians will take care of us, right? We have good relationships. They were good with their hasbara, and if you take care of hasbara, all problems are settled. This was the attitude that existed at that time. But in the book of Yirmiyah, we're going to be given a detailed description of what occurs and how Jews land up in Egypt. And it works as follows. You know the story that the Babylonian king exiles most of the Jews, but he does leave some in Eretz Yisrael. There's still a Jewish presence in the land of Israel after the destruction of the first Bet HaMikdash. And the Babylonian king actually places an individual to become the official leader and the representative of the nation in the land of Israel. And his name is Gedaliah ben Achikam. Gedaliah. His name indicates greatness, and he's a great man. And he is a leader, and he starts the process of solidifying a nation, because many of them were in hiding. Many of them went to other nations in the region. Many Jews escaping this brutal attack of the Babylonians made their way to other nations. He brings them back home. Now, as he is doing so, there are enemies in the region. One of them, the Ammonites. And the Ammonites has a Jew who is unhappy with the leadership of Gedaliah. And therefore, there is a plan of attack to kill Gedaliah. The name of this individual is Yishmael. So Yishmael is planning to kill Gedaliah, and a general, one of the Jews, gets wind of it. His name is Yochanan ben Kerech. So Yochanan informs Gedaliah that what? You're out, someone is going to kill you. And he tells Yochanan that I believe the only way for you to protect yourself is if we uproots the enemy if we actually kill this Yishmael. Now, Gedaliah is a righteous fellow, and he doesn't want to accept the Lashon Hara, right? Doesn't want to hear negative about another person. But sometimes you have to be wise, and many times a person is guilty for not taking information into account, and therefore Gedaliah is killed by this Yishmael. And it's a very significant and tragic event, because it really represents the end of Jewish presence in Eretz Israel. And therefore we mourn that day. We mourn the day of his passing, not on the day itself, but 2 days later. Because Gedaliah was actually killed on Rosh Hashanah. But we wait, we're not going to fast on Rosh Hashanah, so therefore we have the fast of Gedaliah 2 days later. So this is a very significant tragedy that we have with the passing of Gedaliah. Now, Yochanan realizes that this is awful. In other words, there was a serious concern that Gedaliah is a representative of the Babylonians. He is an official recognized by the Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar in Babylonia hears that his representative was killed in Israel. What do you think he's going to do? He'll come back with his army and wipe out the whole country completely. So Yochanan feels that the logical thing to do is to leave the land of Israel to a secure place, and the secure location is going to be the superpower next door, Mitzrayim. This is the plan he has. It's very logical. However, before he does it, he wants to get rabbinic approval, and if not rabbinic, at least prophet approval. Right? You want to be sure that the prophet guides them and gives them an okay. And he had no doubt in his mind, it was a very clear situation, that if you are in a situation of sakana, of danger, you don't have to worry about the laws of the Torah. Right? We have a rule that in a life-threatening situation where the danger is clear and present, you put yourself in a secure location, even if that means leaving the land of Israel and making your way to Egypt. Right? No brainer, but you need to get the word of God. So he turns to Yirmiyahu, and Yirmiyahu says, I'll pray to God and I'll get you the answer. But the answer doesn't come so fast. The answer doesn't come so fast. And you can imagine if you ask a rabbi a question and he gives you an answer 10 days later, right? You'll be a bit suspicious that, he probably didn't know he had to flip a coin and decide if it's kosher or not kosher, right? You'll be suspicious there. So look what happens here, and this is chapter 42 of the book of Yirmiyahu. So Yirmiyahu has an answer for Yochanan. Vayhi miketz, you see it there? Verse 7. And it was after Aseret Yamim, 10 days. Obviously, you know what how the rabbis, if they say the word Aseret Yamim, they assume that it's making reference to the Aseret Yemei Tshuva. But nevertheless, it does take him 10 days. Vayidvar Hashem el Yirmiyahu. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu does communicate with Yirmiyahu. Verse 8. Vayikra el Yochanan ben Kareach. He calls Yochanan. And he calls the generals and the ministers, will call Sareach Hayalim Asherito. And everyone wants to hear the answer. L'chol ha'am lemikaton v'ad gadol. And obviously, they are expecting a green light. And that's very encouraging. In other words, you hear the word of the prophet that it's an okay, so they're going to go with confidence. So I'm sure they already came to him and the luggage was packed, handbags packed. Vayomer alehem, and here's Yirmiyahu. Ko amar Hashem Elokei Israel. This is the God of Israel. And remember, these are words that you want to hear because you sent me to turn to God. Asher shelachtem oti elav. Lehapil techinatchem lefanav. Remember, you sent me to God to turn to Him in prayer. And here is the answer, verse 10. Im shov teshvu ba'aretz hazot. If you settle here, in this land, in the land of Israel, where the question is being asked. So God said, Ubaniti etchem. I'm going to rebuild you. Velo eheros. No more destruction. V'natati etchem, and I'm going to go ahead and plant you, v'lo etosh, and I will not forsake you. Because the God of Israel says, yes, destruction came, but now I have change of heart, or enough was done that therefore I forgive the people. A lot of bad was done in the land of Israel. You can read the book of Eicha and it makes reference to it. But enough is enough. Settle in the land of Israel. Now they're paranoid. What do you mean settle in the land of Israel? They just killed the representative Gedaliah. There is no question in their mind that the Babylonians are coming. So in verse 11 he tells them, Al tira'u mipnei melech Bavel, asher atem yirei mipanav. Fear not the king of Babylonia, that which you fear from. Al tira'u mimeno ne'um Hashem, these are the words of God. Ki itchem ani lahoshia itchem, I am here with you to save you. Ulehatzil etchem miyado, to save you from his hands. Verse 12, Ve'eten lachem rachamim. I'm going to place mercy upon you. Ve'richam etchem, and he'll have mercy upon you. Ve'shiv etchem el admatchem, and he'll let you settle in your land. Now, God knows very well that their desire is to go to the secure location. Ve'im omrim, in verse 13, and if you say, Ve'im omrim atem, lo neshev ba'aretz, I said, we're not settling here. It's scary, right? Land of Israel surrounded by enemies. Land of Israel, Babylonian king is after us. Lebilti shemoa, and you are not going to listen. Bekol Hashem Elokechem, right? If you decide to ignore these words, saying in verse 14, Lo, we're not going to listen to God. Ki eretz Mitzrayim navo, we are going to the secure land of Egypt. And in the land of Egypt, Asher lo nireh milchama, we're not going to see war. V'kol shofar lo nishma, we're not going to hear the trumpets and the sounds of the battlefield. And in Egypt there is security, not just political security, not just militarily, but rather financially as well. It's a settled land, right? The golden Medina was Egypt at that time. V'lalechem lo nirav v'sham neshev, let us settle there in Egypt. If you say that, I'm warning you, says Yirmiyahu. If you ignore what I am saying, in the name of God, and you go for the security, V'ata, verse 15. L'chen shimud var Hashem sherit Yehuda, hear the words of God, the remnants of Yehuda. Koamar Hashem tzvakot, this is the God of legions, says the following, the God of Israel, okay, Israel. Im atem, if you, som tesimun pneichem, if you put your face, meaning if you decide to make your way, lavo Mitzrayim, uvatem, even lagur sham. Now you realize the difference. In the earlier verse it said neshev, and God is warning them, even if you don't go there with the intention of yeshiva. Yeshiva is to settle, but even if you are there only as a ger, to be there on a temporary basis, you should know, verse 16, that sword which you fear so much in the land of Israel is going to go after you. V'haita hacherev, that sword, the sword of Nebuchadnezzar, asher atem yirei mimena, which you fear, sham tasig etchem be'eretz Mitzrayim, it's going to go after you. In the land of Egypt, where you expect security from this superpower, it will reach you there. And this is underlined, not in the Tanakh, but in the printout, because this is what Sforno tells us, that if you look back in the Torah, in Vayikra 33, the first reference, where God said, Vaharikoti achrechem, I'm going to draw out my sword and pursue you. You will be pursued there. You think you could get away from the tsaras that are occurring in the land of Israel? That's not the case. It will pursue you. This is what Yirmiyahu warns them. Ve'hara'av, and you are so afraid of the famine, because land of Israel at the time was mainly destroyed by the Babylonians, and you were afraid that you're not going to have the ability to feed yourselves and your family. Asher atem do'agim mimeno. Guess what? Secure Egypt is going to be hit by it. Sham idbak acharechem Mitzrayim Visham tamutu. You're going to die there. Harsh words. Verse 17. Vayu kol anashim. Right? And this is, Yirmiyah continues here. All those people. Asher samu et pneihem. Who put their faces lavo mitzrayim. To make their way to Egypt. Lagur sham. To live there. Yamutu. They're going to die. Bacherev. Bara'av. Badaver. Sword. Famine. Animals. Velo yelahem. And they're not going to have a remnant, the saridu palit, due to the ra'ah asher ani mevi alehem. God's going to be very harsh here. God of the Bible, right? So, last verse. Ki ko amar Hashem tzvakot Elokei Yisrael, the God of Israel said, Kasher nitach api v'chamati al yoshvei Yerushalayim. Just as I was extremely angry on the people of Jerusalem, ken titach hamati alachem bevoachem Mitzrayim. So too it's going to occur in Egypt. You're going to be like a curse if you don't fear. Now, by the way, in the next chapter, which you don't have here, you know what they say to Yirmiyahu? What do they say to him? Sheker ata dover. You made this all up. Meaning, if what you say doesn't seem right to us, if it's not convenient, you simply made it up. And what happens? They go down to Egypt. And what happens? Superpower Egypt cannot defend them because the armies of the Babylonians attack and destroy Egypt, as the prophet warns. This is what we are told. Now, this idea that Sforno is telling us, this is what the Torah is telling us, that you should know, the sword in Israel, right? You think that if in Eretz Israel they have difficulty, it's their problem? You think that you could be secure somewhere else by saying, well, in Israel they have an issue, it's a bad neighborhood, we'll be secure here because we are thousands of miles away. The Torah is telling us that the sword of Israel chases Jews in other places as well. This is what we are being told. Now, this idea makes its appearance again. Now, there's a section in the Talmud that analyzes a verse in the book of Eicha. The book of Eicha is obviously describing the destruction of the first temple by Yirmiyahu. And the Jews in Babylonia that we are going to be discussing are Jews who live in Babylonia hundreds of years later, during the exile we are in, or after the destruction of the second temple. But nevertheless, you will see an interesting reading here. But let's start with this verse in Eicha. You see Eicha, Perek Aleph, Pasuk Yud Zayin? So here we go. It's in chapter 1. Persa Sion beyadea. Zion stretches out her hand. But unfortunately, ein menachem la. No one to give Zion comfort. No one to give Zion comfort. Next half of the verse. Siva Hashem liYaakov. And this is going to be an interesting reading here. Hashem has decreed for Yaakov that Svivav Tsarav, that his neighbors become his foes. The neighbors, which they tried to work out negotiations and deals and peace treaties, God Almighty said, these neighbors, they're not going to be your friends. This is a verse in Eicha. Come Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda, in the beginning of the 4th century, is living in Babylonia. And he notes the following, that what this verse is telling us, that not just the enemies who surround Israel and the land of Israel are its enemies, but the same nations that cause difficulty on the Jews in the land of Israel are going to cause difficulty to the Jews wherever they are. The same idea that don't think that you could make yourself travel thousands of miles away from the land of Israel and think you are secure from those people who are causing the tsaros in Eretz Israel. They're not going to pursue you. And he's going to read the verse as if it is saying, Tziva Hashem liYaakov, Kadosh Baruch Hu, commanded upon Jacob that unfortunately the tsarav, the enemies, are always going to be around them. Even in Babylonia, those same nations are going to be on your case. So here we have the reading of the Talmud, okay? Tziva Hashem leYaakov. So it starts off with the quote from the verse. Tziva Hashem leYaakov sevivav tzarav, that it to be surrounded by its enemies. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Kegon, an example of this is the way you have the Homanya, which are the Ammonites. Ammonites originate in the land of Ammon, which is near the land of Israel, who are now in Homanya, in a place called Homanya. It's interesting, Homanya, Ammon, it's close enough. But there was in Babylonia a city very close to the city of Pumnahara, which was a Jewish city. These Hammonites were causing great difficulty to the Jews of Pumnahara. Says Rav Yehuda, you see, this is exactly what the verse is talking about. These people from Hamanya originate in Ammon. They cause difficulty to the Jews when the Jews were in the land of Israel. We haven't escaped from them. They are still on our case. And that's what he tells them in English. An example of this is the way the Ammonites in Hamanya act towards the Jews in Pumnahara. The Ammonites brought about the worst persecution of the Jews in Eretz Yisrael, as we are told, by convincing Nebuchadnezzar to destroy the Bet HaMikdash. Don't think we got away from them. But rather, they're still after us. It happened with Nebuchadnezzar. You think you go to Egypt? No security there. You think you go to Babylonia and everything will be fine? They'll be after you as well. Fine. So this is something that we have. Now, I in general, right, I'm not comfortable with applying things into the 20th or 21st century. Right? Number one. Number two, I am not a believer. I have an attitude that we have to work out a way of dealing with the population that is growing in a country, right, and it will become much larger than us very soon. We have to be very practical. And being practical and wise is not to label people what they're not. In other words, the majority, without getting all facts on table here, but the majority of Muslims, let's face it, are not blowing people up. The majority of Muslims are more concerned about getting ahead in business or taking care of their families. It's a fact. Because the fact is that if, God forbid, the majority of them would be terrorists, the planet would be gone. That's a fact. At the same time, let's not ignore realities that there's a percentage of those who follow that faith who have a very problematic view of religion, God, life, and the welfare of others. And that is something that should not be denied either. And I think we all agree that if you have a nation, that there's a percentage of them or a school within that nation, right, that has a very problematic view towards the other. So we all agree that if you have 100 of them in a room, you are safer than if you have 100,000 of them. Statistics. It's a reality. There are those. Look what happened in Europe, right? We're not saying, we have to make this very, very clear, we're not saying they're all like that. But they have some kind of problematic philosophy within their religion that has to be uprooted. How can it be uprooted? Well, historically, they've had periods when the Muslims were the wise men. When Rambam wanted to study wisdom, what language did you have to learn to have access to words of wisdom? Arabic. There's no question about that. Now, this is something that even people like, there was recently Rabbi Sachs was interviewed. And he's very careful, and he's a very tolerant individual, but he says this exact same thing, that there is a serious problem that they have to deal with. We can't ignore it. And there were times, obviously, that they did a better job in dealing with it. Now, here in Canada, I looked up recently the number of Muslims that were here, not that I have a problem with it, in 1969, 1970, vis-a-vis the numbers today and the numbers that are predicted in the future, right? And I don't think I'm surprising anyone that it's increasing. It's increasing. And we are very soon, it's a fact that we have to accept. It's a fact that Europe has, it's a fact that we are going to have, and our prayers should be long and should be without talking, and the prayers should be that they somehow are inspired to rediscover what their religion is about. And religion does have, in other words, you could have the same text, but in different generations there's a focus on something very, very different. Even Judaism, you can't compare the focus of Judaism in the day we had prophets to the day the rabbis were guiding us. In the era of prophets, many people probably weren't familiar with the words of Torah. They would hear it once in a while in shul. When in the days of the rabbis, people know every single word. Times change, right? The focus of the religion changes. And that's our prayer, that they have a shift. But the reality is that if I would interview someone here in Canada in 1970, and I would ask them about Muslims, extreme views of Islam, terrorism, they will say, yeah, the Jews in Israel have a problem there. No, it's a problem to live in Israel. They have an issue there, and Baruch Hashem, we're safe here. Right? Maybe they won't say it, but they'll feel it. We're safe here in Canada. We don't have any such issue. That's the attitude that perhaps would have existed, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, because most of you do remember 1970 and the attitude that existed then, and even if you didn't say it, perhaps you were thinking it. And then you read this verse. This is a warning that as Jews, we have to always be concerned for the welfare of people of Israel and never feel, well, they are in a dangerous situation. We are, Baruch Hashem, in a safe environment. That is not kosher thinking. Kosher thinking is that we are one nation, and their difficulties are our difficulties. And the reality is that if we start developing an attitude as, yeah, they have difficulties, but we are safe, the Almighty is going to go ahead and take that nation, or here it's presented as a sword, and just as it went after them when they go to secure Egypt, and just as it went after them when they go to secure Pum-Nahara in Babylonia, it goes after them. This is what we are told in this text. But we have to end with optimism. If we are going to biblical sources, we have to end with optimism, and that is when Avraham Avinu dies. Right? We're always fighting over his identity. I remember once taking a flight from, I think it was from Toronto to Memphis through Charlotte on the U.S. Air. And I was sitting there with a Gemara learning, and there was a young lady, a Muslim, studying with her, it wasn't the Gemara, she had the Quran. And she asked me, so she seemed like a very educated woman and friendly, and she asked me what I'm learning. I said, Talmud, tell me a little about what you're learning. She tells me a little bit about Akedat Ishmael. And she was surprised, and she asked me, how can you be a rabbi and not know that there's a different version of the Akedat Yitzchak? Shouldn't you know these facts? And I didn't want to get into a discussion that to go ahead and take a story, it's like rewriting Shakespeare today, and saying that actually, right, Shiloh wasn't a pound of flesh, it was a pound of corned beef, right? Now this is doing the same thing, because by the 7th century, the Tanakh is already written in many, many languages, and many, many people know already that it's Akedat Yitzchak, and they somehow have that ability of taking that old story and saying that it applies to Ishmael. Very fascinating, very creative, right? So this is an interaction, that she shares with me a little bit about their view of Ishmael, because we're both fighting over the legacy of Avraham. Well, the Torah tells us that when it came time to bury Avraham, the father that brings us together, the Torah makes it clear that even though Ishmael was older, who took the lead, who was honored, who was recognized as the son, the real son, the carrier of the tradition? Yitzchak the Ishmael. Yitzchak is mentioned first. And this is Ishmael allowing him to go first. And this is what the rabbis tell us, that Ishmael, at the end of his life, does tshuva. He has a full recognition of the unique role of the Jews, of the children of Yitzchak. And the rabbis tell us that this is a reference to Messianic era as well. The Yishmaelim will do teshuvah. In other words, there will be a time that they're going to go ahead and have recognition of our unique role, recognition of our right, and that is what's going to bring the peace. So we end, in other words, these issues that we have, these serious concerns that we have, concerns that at least we learned today that we can't place them in the land of Israel and feel, it's difficulty for them, but we, thank God, are okay here in America. We're proud Americans, right? Even our menorahs have U.S. flags. In other words, if you look at the culture of the United States, it's all about we are secure. Oh, Israel is a problem? So let's detach ourselves from the concern for the state of Israel, which is happening in the United States. If you look at polls of young Democrats, the majority of, close to the majority, or perhaps more, are not the supporters of Israel that was the norm in the United States 50 years ago. Concerns exist. And this is a lot of Jews who detach themselves. Detachment is not going to work. Hope, right? Hope. And the belief that Ishmael will do tshuva is what we should be waiting for, but we have to feel the achdut, the concern, and this is the message we get from this week's Parsha. Thank you very much. We see you B'ezrat Hashem next week.